We now come to the backbench motion of the performance of Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. Esther McVey to move.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this House notes that the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, continues to need substantial revision, as recognised by the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, with patient safety concerns persisting and exacerbating since the review's publications in 2020. Notes too that the MHRA's 2017 Expert Working Group's reports on Primados was deeply flawed, with IMMDS later concluding the drug had caused avoidable harm. Further notes that the yellow card system for reporting suspected adverse drug reactions is failing, with no process for following up on serious or fatal reactions, and conflict of interests existing, with 75% of the MHRA's funding being derived from industry fees, a concern raised in the 2004 and 5 House of Commons Health Committee report, The Influence of the Pharmaceutical Industry, and also notes that the MHRA's delayed response to reports of myocarditis, pericarditis and vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia following COVID-19 vaccinations, despite actions from regulators in other countries, and calls on the government to fully implement the recommendations of the IMDS review and to acknowledge the harm done to patients and the financial burden on the healthcare system as a result of the MHRA's widespread regulatory failures. I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate today, and I thank many colleagues from across the House who have supported the application to the committee, especially the Honourable Member for Blackley and Broughton, and also the Honourable Members for Bolton South and Walkden and Great Yarmouth. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, is the body responsible for ensuring the safety and efficacy of medicines used in the UK. It is their job to oversee medical products, medicines, medical devices and blood components for transfusion. The responsibility they have is extremely important, as it comes with not only the potential to change people's lives for the better, but also to cause serious harm, even death, if poor decisions are made or safety signals are missed. The MHRA are required to scrutinise applications from the pharmaceutical companies for new products and devices, and also remain ever vigilant over existing drugs should safety problems arise post-authorisation. They have to weigh up the arguments for and against these products and devices. After all, the companies trying to get these products onto the market and keep them there are driven, like all industries are, by commercial success. It is up to the MHRA to balance this with the health and safety of the UK and the public. So I think alarm bells rang for many of us when in March 2022, Dame June Rain, the Chief Executive of the MHRA, boasted of the agency's transition from watchdog to enabler. 20 years ago, the Health Committee report entitled The Influence of the Pharmaceutical Industry found that the MHRA was unusual in being one of the few European agencies funded entirely by fees derived from the services to this industry. Not much has changed, with the MHRA continuing to get 75% of its funding from the pharmaceutical industry. In this context, the agency's transition from watchdog to enabler does little to quell suspicions of conflicts and the implications that has for patient safety. One of the most worrying issues is the MHRA's mismanagement of the yellow card system. Established in 1964, the system is a way for patients, relatives and healthcare professionals to report suspected adverse reactions to drugs or medical devices. This reporting scheme should be a valuable source of information about possible harms and to act as an early warning system. But we know that there is a gross underreporting to the scheme and that the DS review in 2020 put it, the system is too complex and too diffuse to allow early signal detection. Underreporting is a big problem because it makes it difficult to spot safety signals and assign causation. This then translates into unnecessary harm or deaths with devastating side effects, from treatment going unnoticed for years, months, or even decades. This was recognised by the IMDS review led by Baroness Cumberledge in the case of Primodos, sodium valproate, and surgical mesh. Maybe it should have been mess, but it was mesh. According to research from Bangor University in 2019, potentially avoidable adverse drug reactions are costing the NHS $2.2 billion a year in hospital admissions. In 2018, the MHRA estimated that only 10% of serious reactions and between 2 to 4% of non-serious reactions are reported. More recently, they've claimed that reporting rates for COVID vaccines are better due to higher public awareness, but they haven't been able to point to published evidence to back that claim up. The yellow card is currently a voluntary scheme, which doctors and members of the public can report to, but I would like to echo the calls from the Sling the Mesh campaign and others to follow the example of Denmark and Sweden and make it mandatory for all healthcare professionals to report suspected adverse reactions. Next, I'd like to turn to the MHRA's failure to act promptly on evidence of adverse reactions. We've seen this historically, such as in the case of sodium valproate, which was known to cause harm to unborn babies in the 1980s. And yet the MHRA did not establish a valproate pregnancy prevention plan until 2018. The known harms to unknown babies were allowed to persist for over 30 years. And more recently, in 2021, we saw how slowly the MHRA reacted to strong signals that there was a serious problem with the AstraZeneca vaccine causing an autoimmune condition called vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia. Denmark and other European countries suspended the vaccine for all age groups on the 11th of March 2021. The MHRA, by contrast, only started to restrict the vaccine in some age groups nearly 2 months later on the 7th of May. And yet, there was a signal in the yellow card reports as early as the 8th of February. How many people were needlessly exposed to a risk?
Well,
I will indeed.
I'm very grateful. I think she's hit on a really important point. And what action did the MHRA take to apologise or explain its failure to give adequate and timely warnings to potential patients?
I don't believe they have, and we're probably still waiting for those. And this hopefully will come out. It's not just that, it's also the compensation scheme that these people aren't either getting quickly enough or whether it's commensurate with actually the illness and damage that has been caused to them. I think it's also worth noting what happened when the Daily Telegraph reported on this potential causal link between the AstraZeneca vaccine and blood clots in March 2021. The journalist who wrote the story received a threatening call from the MHRA warning that the Telegraph would be banned from future briefings and press notices if they did not soften the news. An extremely defensive approach for an agency whose number one strategic objective is to maintain public trust through transparency and proactive communication. Does this sound like an agency that it's doing its best to maintain public trust, let alone patient safety? It's clear the system doesn't work. We have good evidence that suspected adverse reactions are underreported, but what about the ones that are reported? Well, we know from Freedom of Information requests that MHRA does not hold a process for the investigation and follow-up of individual yellow card reports. We know that retrieval of follow-up information from the yellow card database still requires manual extraction, and we also know that only 54% of deaths reported as possibly linked to the exposure of one of the COVID-19 vaccines were followed up by the MHRA. Extremely worrying or as Matt Hancock infamously described it in a 2021 WhatsApp, shonky. And the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, replied to that WhatsApp message saying the system needs to get better. Another long-standing problem at the MHRA is their lack of transparency. Take FOIs to the agency as an example. Between 2008 and 2017, only 41% of requests were successful. And in 2021, 76% were answered outside the 20 working day statutory response time. A culture of delay, secrecy has emerged, and MHRA's behaviour around the Commission on Human Medicine meetings for COVID-19 Vaccine Benefit Risk Expert Working Group show this beyond any doubt. Minutes of these meetings were published just last month, 4 years after the meeting took place. Why the delay? And they're stuffed full of redactions, which leaves us with many more questions than answers, particularly as to why these new vaccines were continually described as safe and effective. In the meeting on the 18th of November 2020, the expert working group asks if Pfizer were required to respond to the 36 questions asked by MHRA. And in response, the MHRA confirmed there is no formal obligation to reply. Why is there no formal obligation to reply? Surely it is essential when making such an important decision as whether to allow a new vaccine to be rolled out to the nation, we need those replies. The minutes don't specify the 36 questions, and indeed they don't appear to have been mentioned again. I asked a written question last week to see if, in the spirit of openness and transparency, the MHRA would publish these questions and any answers received from Pfizer. The response, the MHRA does not intend to publish these questions or any subsequent responses. Why not? Isn't this a matter for public interest? These issues weren't resolved before the MHRA gave the green light to start the vaccination to the nation. Particularly worrying is the issue of lymphopenia, where your blood doesn't have enough white blood cells, which was reported in phase 1 of the trials and then goes away. Not because they fixed the problem, but because testing for the condition was not conducted in phase 2 and phase 3. In summary, the failure to act on the weaknesses of the MHRA will only lead to more harm and further damage to the public's trust in the Pharmaceuticals Agency and those tasked with regulating them. My hope is that this debate helps bring these wide-ranging issues further to the light and focuses the Minister's mind on finding solutions. And finally, I'd like to end on the words of Dr. Tom Jefferson of the University of Oxford. You cannot support both secrecy and vaccination. Requesting data is not a sign of being against drugs or vaccines. It shows that you are in favour of transparency. Those who try to keep data confidential and criticise those who ask for evidence are anti an evidence-based approach. How can you have informed consent if you don't know precisely what is happening? I will indeed.
On that point, will my right honourable friend accept that one of the consequences of the lack of transparency has been a public distrust of vaccines, which is rapidly spreading and has got the consequence that, for example, MMR vaccines, there's not much less take-up than there should be and used to be, and that's because of a lack of trust in the system.
My honourable friend makes a very good point there. If people lose trust in vaccines, if they lose trust in the pharmaceutical industry, if they lose trust in the regulatory agency, this is precisely what happens. And we know those vaccines are essential to many people, and that is not what we want to happen. We just want to make sure that new vaccines, new medicines coming to use are thoroughly tested, and along the way we keep an overall watch that they are working correctly.